Hello, my name is Crystal Petry, and you are watching the Crystal Petry Podcast. On today's podcast, we are going to talk about the hotly contested, the greatly talked about presidential election between, messed that up. Let me start that over. We're going to talk about, okay. Hello, my name is Crystal Petry, and you are watching the Crystal Petry Podcast. On today's podcast, I have National Political Strategist Whit Ayres here to speak about the presidential election of 2024. So welcome to the podcast.
Crystal, good to be with you.
Thank you so much. I know that you are extremely busy during this time of year. So thank you for giving us a little bit of time to talk about the presidential election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. My first question for you, Whit, is we are exactly 1 week away from the election with Harris and Trump basically tied at 48%. If the election were held today, who do you think would win and why?
There's no way in the world to know that right now. All 7 of the swing states are effectively tied. Trump has gotten stronger over the course of the last 10 days or so, but he had been a point or two behind nationally and in many of those states. So all that's done is make the race closer. I don't know what will happen. I do know that the few undecided voters frequently do not split evenly. They often will gravitate toward one candidate or the other, depending on events that happen close to the end of the campaign. So while the 7 swing states might split 4 for one and 3 for the other, it wouldn't surprise me if one of these candidates won 6 or maybe all 7 of them. I just don't know which one right now.
Wow, that would absolutely be something. At this point in time, over 43 million early votes have been cast. And we're talking in-person and mail-in ballots as well. That is significantly down from 4 years ago. Why do you think that is going on?
Because we're not in the middle of a major worldwide pandemic that killed millions of people. There was a huge incentive for people to vote early or particularly absentee 4 years ago because we were in the throes of the pandemic. We're fortunately beyond that now. And so a lot more people will feel comfortable voting in person.
And as I stated, the early voting is significantly down. But in the state of Georgia, their early voting numbers are actually significantly higher than any other state across the nation. Why do you think Georgia is getting out to vote at such an increasing number?
There is a very, very intense interest in the race in Georgia. Both candidates have spent millions of dollars on the air there, and it's likely to be very, very close. It was one of the closest states in 2020. Joe Biden won it by 11,779 votes, as we recall from that infamous phone call that Donald Trump had with the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. And it may very well be as close again this year. So I think that's why people are so interested in it.
Do you think, Walt, that Georgia is becoming a purple state at this day and time?
Not really. It's still a red state that is close. The only reason Joe Biden won 4 years ago is 30,000 voters went to the polls and skipped the presidential ballot and then voted for Republican candidates down the ballot, which is why the Republican candidates did so well below the presidency. So 30,000 people skipped the presidential race. Joe Biden won by less than 12,000. That suggests to me that it is a peculiar nature of the 2 candidates of Biden and Trump that were running in 2020, rather than the fact that Georgia has become a real Democratic or even a purple state, a true swing state. It's the characteristic of the 2 candidates. But if you look at the other offices, they're overwhelmingly held by Republicans.
Correct. In 2024, for this presidential election, Whit, over 41 million Gen Zers are going to be able to vote. And that's your age range of 18 to 27-year-olds. Do you think that they will have an impact either way with Trump or Harris during this presidential election?
Well, anytime a race is this close, any significant group of people could have an impact, but we don't know what direction it's going to be. It appears as though the gender gap is largest among younger voters, much larger than it is among older voters, where young men are more attracted to Trump and young women more attracted to Kamala Harris, particularly given the prominence of the abortion issue. So we could have a huge gender gap among young people. And whether or not they help one candidate or the other depends upon whether the margin by which Trump wins men is larger, the same, or greater than the margin by which Kamala Harris is going to win women.
What do you think is the reason, Whit, whenever former President Donald Trump won his first presidential election, it was Caucasian women that overwhelmingly voted for him and put him over the top? What has changed? And now that men are leading the pack in voting for former President Donald Trump?
Well, what has changed is that we've had the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe versus Wade, which elevated abortion on the list of prominent issues. It is among the most prominent issues for Democrats and independents who lean Democratic. And Kamala Harris has made it one of the top issues in her campaign. So that, I think that's the reason. Now, keep in mind, white women without college degrees are still voting for Trump. But the margins between men overall and women overall are as great this year as they've been certainly since 2016, when they were also quite large.
Let's talk about the abortion issue for just a little bit, Walt. Vice President Kamala Harris wants to put it back in the federal hands. Former President Donald Trump succeeded in putting it into the state's hands. Kamala Harris stated that if elected, she would put it back in federal. Do you think she will be able to put the abortion issue back into federal hands? Is that something that needs to happen, or does it need to stay with the states?
I think it would be very, very difficult for Kamala Harris or anybody else to develop a national consensus on the abortion issue. I think it would be very, very hard to get a piece of legislation through a relatively evenly divided Congress that's going to ensure abortion access everywhere in the country. I happen to think that this issue should have been left to the states originally. And that in 1973, the Roe versus Wade decision took it out of state hands and tried to settle the issue at the federal level, sort of like the Supreme Court tried to settle the slavery issue with the Dred Scott decision. And we saw how successful that was too. So I just don't think there's any possible way you are going to be able to come up with an abortion law that's seen as credible in both Mississippi and Massachusetts. The cultures of our states are so dramatically different that I think it makes sense to leave this highly emotional and highly complex issue in the hands of the states rather than trying to institute a federal law.
Roe versus Wade has been the law of the land for over 50 years. Why do you think it was never codified?
Because they could never get a consensus on codifying what was in it. That's why, which is why I don't think they're going to be able to get a consensus now if Kamala Harris gets elected. I think that the views on it are so strong and so opposite and so intense that it's very, very difficult to get a consensus. You could never have had the Roe versus Wade standard passed through a Congress at any time in the last 50 years, in my judgment.
Okay. Let's talk about former President Donald Trump. He held a presidential rally at Madison Square Garden in New York City. He had a comedian there that it is said the jokes that the comedian gave were off color, were racist, were Latino baiting. Can former President Donald Trump come back from that? Is that something he has to worry about?
Crystal, I don't know why you would say he was race baiting and Latino baiting just because he said there was an island of trash floating in the ocean that they call Puerto Rico. I mean, really? No, we're known by the associates we keep, and people make judgments based upon the kinds of people whom we invite to our own rallies. That said, it's hard to imagine that a comment by a very unfunny comic is going to have a substantial effect on the race. I know a lot of Harris supporters hope that it does and believe that it will. I'm skeptical.
Do you think former President Donald Trump needs to speak out or say something about what was said at his rally?
What I think Donald Trump ought to do has no resemblance of anything Donald Trump would do or would even consider doing.
That's absolutely true. That is true, Whit. Vice President Kamala Harris campaigned in Texas last week. She had some celebrities there. She had Beyonce there. She had Kelly Rowland there. She also had Colin Allred there, who is running for Senate in the state of Texas. Texas is a known red state. Do you think that her campaign, bringing out all of the celebrities, will have a positive impact on her or a negative impact?
Oh, I think if it has any impact at all, it'll be positive. You can't be hurt by being surrounded by really famous people who are supporting you. She doesn't have any chance of carrying Texas, and she knows that. Just like Donald Trump doesn't have any chance of carrying New York, but he had a rally in Madison Square Garden. It's all a matter of getting energy and getting excitement built, and maybe trying to help Colin Allred, who's running a very strong race against Ted Cruz, maybe get over the hump there in Texas.
Absolutely. Now, for Republicans, right now, African Americans are voting for Republicans more than any other time before the Civil War or after the Civil War. Why do you think that is? Why are African Americans going over to the Republican Party when normally they vote strictly Democratic?
It's all economics. People on the lower end of the income scale have had a very, very difficult time making ends meet with this inflation that just spiraled up in the middle of the pandemic and immediately thereafter. And you have gas prices that are $1 higher per gallon on average in the Biden years as opposed to the pre-pandemic Trump years. $100 worth of food in 2019 costs $125 today. And while inflation may be moderating, it's not going backwards. And you're never going to be able to get $100 worth of food for $100 again. It's always going to be $125 or higher. Interest rates were about a third what they are now, which means that the ability to afford a house is completely different now. So it's all a matter of people on the lower end of the economic scale, Hispanic, African American, white, whatever race, who find the Biden economy hurting them compared to the pre-pandemic Trump economy. And that's the reason Trump is doing so much better among minorities than is typical of most Republicans.
President Obama was campaigning for Kamala Harris about a week ago, and he has come under fire for some statements that he made that African-American men are not voting for Kamala Harris because she is a woman, and they are voting for former President Donald Trump because he is a man. Do you think that that is a fair assessment of African-American men?
I don't know the answer to that. You're probably better able to answer that than I am, Crystal. I do know that there are men of any race who are sometimes skeptical of having a woman president because we've never had one. But that does not take into account the many women leaders that other countries have had, or Margaret Thatcher in England, or Golda Meir in Israel. There are numerous countries that have had female chief executives. And so I think it's just a matter of the fact that we haven't had one that causes men to have that reaction.
Let's talk about the vice presidents for a little bit. Do you feel that J.D. Vance, who is the running mate with former President Donald Trump, and Tim Walz, which is the running mate for current Vice President Kamala Harris, are they making an impact at all in this presidential election?
Vice presidents rarely make an impact on the top of the ticket. Some people will vote against the top of the ticket because they're worried about a vice president. I'm thinking about people voting against John McCain because they didn't believe Sarah Palin was ready to be one heartbeat away from the presidency. But rarely do people vote for. I think it needs to be said that when Donald Trump picked J.D. Vance, he thought he was running against Joe Biden and thought he was going to waltz into the White House. So rather than picking someone who could help him win, he was picking his successor for the MAGA movement. And I don't know that he'd make the same decision if he were making the decision after he knew he was running against Kamala Harris. In the case of Tim Walz, he brings absolutely nothing to the ticket in terms of electoral votes that Kamala Harris didn't already have. He comes from Minnesota, which has voted for the Democratic candidate for president every single election for the last half century. I think she really blew her VP pick. You would think if there's 7 swing states that are going to decide the election, you might pick a vice president from one of the 7 swing states. And she had an obvious choice, Josh Shapiro, the governor, the very popular governor of Pennsylvania. I saw one poll that said if he were on the ticket, she'd be up 5 points in Pennsylvania rather than a dead even tie. So I think she really made a serious mistake with her vice presidential pick, which could end up costing her the election.
Okay. President Joe Biden has not been seen on the campaign trail hardly at all. Why do you think that is? Is he focused on ending out his presidential term on a high note? Does he not want to get in the way, so to speak, of Kamala Harris?
America wants to fire the Joe Biden economy. America hates Bidenomics. Americans believe that they were much better off under Trump than they are under Joe Biden. It would hurt Kamala Harris to have Joe Biden be more prominent in the campaign. In fact, part of her problem, I think, is that she has not separated herself sufficiently from Joe Biden because she needs to be a change candidate when 2/3 of the country thinks we're going the wrong direction. And it's hard for her to be a change candidate if she's sitting there very close to Joe Biden. So I think Joe Biden needs to stay invisible if he has any interest in helping Kamala Harris win.
Do you think Kamala Harris needs to negatively, I guess, throw President Joe Biden under the bus to disassociate herself from him?
No, you don't need to throw him under the bus, but you do need to articulate a vision for what your administration would look like that's different from what the Joe Biden administration looked like. And I don't believe she's done a particularly good or thorough job of that so far. An awful lot of what she said looks like an extension of some of the things Joe Biden has done rather than a different direction. And that's a problem for a candidate running at a time when people want change.
Okay. The LA Times and the Washington Post, for the first time, and I can't even remember, has not endorsed a candidate either way in this presidential election. Jeff Bezos is the owner of the Washington Post. There have been many reporters that have quit at the Washington Post. Many people have canceled their Amazon Prime accounts because of this. Why do you think those newspapers chose not to endorse anyone during this presidential election?
Because those newspapers are owned by major businessmen who have enormous companies that could very well be affected by government policy. And if Donald Trump gets elected, he's made no secret of his desire to go after people who haven't been supportive. Amazon has lots of government contracts. And I think what's happening there is that these businessmen are protecting their business interests.
It is said that if former President Donald Trump is reelected again, it will be a revenge tour, a revenge election. Do you think that is true? And do you think that is fair for the American people?
He certainly said that it's going to be. He said he's going to go after his enemies. He said he's going to use the military to attack the enemy within. Based on what he said, I think we ought to believe that he is going to try to do exactly what he said he was going to do, and that is use all the powers of the federal government to go after people who've criticized him and haven't supported him.
Do you think that's fair for the American people? Should he just focus on the policies and the economy?
That's a judgment the American people are going to make next Tuesday.
It is. It absolutely is. Let's talk about some demographics and behavior, Whit. How has the demographic shift in the U.S. electorate affected the Republican Party's chances of winning the election?
I wrote a whole book about how it was important for the Republican Party to adapt to a changing election, to a changing America, and to the changing demographics of America. It's very important that the Republican Party, to win nationally, not be so totally reliant on white voters. And Donald Trump, to his credit, has brought in a number of Hispanic and African American voters that weren't there before. George W. Bush did a very good job with Hispanics in 2004. He got about 44% of the Hispanic vote. That's the high watermark up to this point. So it's entirely possible for Republicans to get the votes of minorities, but they have to try and they have to reach out. And I think that's what the Republicans are going to need to do more of in the future.
How should the GOP address challenges posed by the growing influence of younger, more diverse voters? I know we spoke earlier about this year, over 41 million Gen Z voters ages 18 to 27 will be voting in this election.
You adopt policies and messages that talk about expanding opportunities for those people. They have been through an awful lot. Most recently, a worldwide pandemic, which shut the economies down of much of the rest of the world. So I think you adopt policies and adopt a message that appeals directly to a much more diverse generation than my generation, for example.
Has the Republican Party standing among rural voters changed?
It has strengthened. It used to be that rural voters, particularly in the South, were solidly Democratic. But right now in the modern era, they are solidly behind Donald Trump and provide the core of his support. He is going to do exceedingly well in the rural areas of the country, 70, 75, 80% of the vote in some rural areas. So they've become the backbone of the Republican Party, or at least the Trump Republican Party.
How do you think the party should address the generational divide between the older, more traditional Republicans and the younger, more progressive voters?
By talking about the opportunities for both, they have very different issues, very different sets of issues. And so you put together a whole platform, a whole set of issues that addresses the concerns of each generation. But in the case of older voters, the solvency of Social Security and the solvency of Medicare are very real issues that neither one of these candidates is addressing, frankly, and that Joe Biden didn't want to address. But we're going to have to address those issues because those programs are going to go bankrupt unless some changes are made. Ronald Reagan showed how you can handle that by putting together a bipartisan commission that would make recommendations and then have an up or down vote on those recommendations in Congress. Because Ronald Reagan did that, Social Security was on a more sound financial footing for the next half century. We need to do something like that again, or the thing's going to go bankrupt.
What does America look like? And this is strictly your opinion I'm asking, without a Social Security safety net.
We'll never have that. I mean, they'll shut down the Pentagon before we'll shut down Social Security.
Wow.
I don't need to worry about that. It's not going to go bankrupt. But the question is what changes we're going to make to ensure that it doesn't. but people do not have to worry about losing Social Security or losing Medicare. Politically, they are too overwhelmingly powerful, and there's no politician that would let that happen.
With polling, of course, we know that polling can never be 100% accurate as far as stating what candidate will win which election. What is your assessment of how polling has performed in the recent elections? Can it be improved for better accuracy in future elections?
Well, polling is very good in the broad outline. Polls are not precise enough to tell you the winner of essentially a dead heat race, or one that's separated by 1 or 2 points, which is why I have said I don't know who's going to win this thing. Polling was dead on the money in 2018 and 22, although it did understate the Democratic support somewhat in some states in 2022. For the most part, it did pretty well. It did underestimate Donald Trump's support in 2016 and 2020. So is it going to be the same this year, or is it going to be more like 2022 or 2012, where polling underestimated Democratic support? We'll find out next week. But for the most part, pollsters have done a lot of adjusting to take account of past errors, for example, making sure we've got the appropriate number of non-college white voters in the sample. And we're going to find out next week how well we did.
Absolutely. Whit, as one of the nation's top political strategists, I'm going to ask you a strategy question here. What do you think the Democratic Party is doing correct, and what do you think they need to improve on? And my follow-up question will be the same, but for the Republican Party. What do you think the Republican Party is doing correct, and what do you think they need to improve on?
Well, the Democratic Party should have had a replacement for Joe Biden in the summer of 2023, so they could have had a robust primary process and perhaps come up with a stronger candidate than Kamala Harris. But Joe Biden hung on and hung on and hung on so long that it became patently obvious after the June debate that he was incapable of serving another 4 years. He backed the Democratic Party into taking basically the only choice they had at that point, which was Kamala Harris. So that's one thing the Democratic Party could have done a lot better, but they didn't do. And they may very well suffer for it, because Kamala Harris is widely viewed as one of the weaker members of the administration, certainly compared to people like Pete Buttigieg at transportation or Gia Raimondo at commerce. But I think she's done overall about as good a job as she could do with her skills and her experience, other than the vice presidential pick that I mentioned. I think she's done a remarkable job given the pressure cooker she was thrown into. I think the Republicans have got to figure out how to get more than 47% of the vote. We'll see if Donald Trump did this time. Republicans have lost the popular vote repeatedly over the last 9 presidential elections. It's really hard to govern the country if you don't have majority support behind what you're trying to do. And so I would love to see Republicans come up with a strategy that would reach out beyond the existing base of the party and try to build majority popular support.
You know, you spoke about it, Whit, in your answer, but I don't think the majority of Americans even realize that we did not have a primary for this presidential election for the Democratic side, that the selection for Kamala Harris was just made for us, and we were expected to just go along with that.
Joe Biden forced the party into that result. He didn't need to. He shouldn't have, but he did. And so the Democratic Party is stuck with the outcome because of his selfish hold on trying to maintain power, even though it was obvious to one and all that he was not capable of serving effectively for 4 more years.
How do you think the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, how do you see them evolving over the next decade?
It all depends upon whether Donald Trump wins the presidency next week or not. The Republican Party will look very, very different 4 years from now if Donald Trump is the incumbent president, or if Donald Trump gets defeated this year. And it'll be a totally different story. very, very difficult to anticipate without knowing whether or not Donald Trump's going to get elected or not.
Do you think current elected officials, Republicans, should distance themselves from Donald Trump?
If they do, it'll kill their careers, which is why they don't.
Do you think that, and again, this is strictly opinion based, that is fair? That if the choice...
Crystal, my job is to assess public opinion and do the best job I can at analyzing and interpreting public opinion and its effect on the country. So I'm going to stick to my lane here and try to analyze public opinion rather than spout off on my own.
Okay. Let's speak about the media and the changing landscape with that. Has the media affected either way this presidential election?
Oh, the dominant media is totally in the tank for Kamala Harris. I mean, it's not even pretending to try to be fair right now. I mean, just look at today's edition of the New York Times and tell yourself, which candidate do you think they would really, really, really want to have win? Now, when Donald Trump has called the media the enemy of the people, you can kind of understand why they are not in his corner. But they are totally in the tank for Kamala Harris. On the other hand, the social media and the niche cable companies have picked out their candidate, and they present news in a way that gives the best possible view of their particular favorite candidate.
And Fox News, do you think that they have played a critical role in this presidential election?
Sure. They're as far in the tank for Donald Trump as the New York Times is for Kamala Harris. And all they're going to do is present data that they think will help Donald Trump.
What role do you think political advertising has played in this election and the elections to come?
Well, I think it's played a lot of role. It plays a relatively smaller role in the presidential race than it does in down ballot races, because there are so many other avenues to get information in a presidential race. But I think some of the advertising on Kamala Harris and her left-wing views when she ran before, particularly on trans issues, has really hurt her and has made it more difficult for her to build a lead in this race.
Kamala Harris, piggybacking on the trans issue, Kamala Harris stated that she was for trans. Do you think that she should roll back from that stance on transgender individuals? Is that helping or hurting her?
Of course it's hurting her. It's hurting her a lot. I think she needs to roll that back. She's already said she's not for many of the positions that she took in 2019, like banning fracking, banning offshore oil drilling, banning private health insurance, and instituting mandatory gun buyback programs. She said she's not for those things, but she hasn't really explained why. All she said is, my values haven't changed. Well, what does your values not changing have to do with offshore oil drilling? I think she needs to make a better explanation for it. And it's possible to do that easily, to say, I've been in the vice presidency 4 years. I've learned things I didn't know before. And therefore, I've adjusted my views like we want everyone to do when they've learned new information. But I haven't heard that compelling an argument from her, at least not yet.
As we get ready to wrap up with my final question for you, do you think presidential debates, vice presidential debates are even needed anymore? Do they have an impact at all?
Of course they have an impact. The first presidential debate completely upended the entire election and drove Joe Biden from the race. I don't know how we could say that debates don't matter when you have a debate that has completely changed the foundation of this race. Obviously, some debates matter more than others. I thought Kamala Harris did a superb job in her one debate with Donald Trump, which is why Donald Trump didn't want to debate again. But of course, debates can have a substantial influence on the outcome.
Thank you, Whit, so much for imparting your knowledge and your wisdom on this podcast. I appreciate you so much.
My pleasure.
And to my viewers and to my listeners, thank you so much for tuning in and watching. You can get this podcast and all of my other podcasts on YouTube Podcasts and Apple Podcasts. And remember, you always have time to listen and learn on the go.